Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are breaking down a really pivotal moment in modern history. We're going to look at how governments, all across the political spectrum, responded to the huge economic crises of the early 20th century. So, picture this: 1929. The world's money just vanishes. What happens next? Well, to get into that, we've got to start with the single biggest economic shock of the modern era: the Great Depression. And this wasn't just any crisis, It was so profound, it literally forced nations to completely rethink what a government is even supposed to do. Right, so before we can even talk about the solutions, we first have to get a handle on just how massive this problem was. And here's the thing you have to remember. The chaos didn't just pop up out of nowhere with the 1929 stock market crash. Nope, the seeds for this disaster were planted way, way earlier. It was, the absolute perfect storm. First, you've got Germany just getting crushed by post-World War I debt. Then you have this new farming tech that's, it's too good. It creates this massive surplus of food, which sounds great, right? But it actually tanked prices for farmers. And then the big one, the US stock market collapses. That financial panic just spread like wildfire across the globe, leading to these terrifying bank runs that literally wiped out people's life savings overnight. So what do you do when something like this happens? Well, the first instinct for a lot of countries was to basically slam the door shut, economically speaking. They jacked up tariffs, thinking, hey, let's protect our own industries. But it backfired. And it backfired spectacularly. All it did was choke off international trade, which just made the crisis way worse. Suddenly you have unbelievable levels of unemployment, and everyone is desperate for some kind of answer. So over in the United States, they came to a crossroads. Their answer wasn't to just throw capitalism out the window. Instead, it was to step in and fundamentally change how it worked. And believe me, this was a radical shift. And it was all guided by a brand new, pretty revolutionary economic idea. And that idea has a name: Keynesian economics. It comes from an economist, John Maynard Keynes, and it was a total game changer. So what's the core concept? It's pretty simple, actually. When the economy is in a free fall, the government shouldn't just stand back and watch. It should actively step in and spend money to get things moving again, to create demand. Now, at the time, this was completely against conventional wisdom, but it became the bedrock, the intellectual foundation for how America decided to fight back. Okay, so how did they actually put this theory into practice? Well, that's where President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal comes in. This was this huge, sprawling series of programs with a really clear three-part mission: relief, recovery, and reform. Relief for people who were suffering right now, recovery to get the economy back on its feet, and reform to make sure this kind of collapse couldn't happen again. And that meant massive government-funded projects, building dams, roads, bridges, all to create jobs and put people back to work. All right, so while the US is trying to basically save capitalism from itself, the Soviet Union, they took a completely different path. A radically different one. Their response wasn't about fixing the system. It was about destroying it entirely and replacing it with a pretty brutal solution of total, absolute state control. So, you see, after Lenin died, Joseph Stalin takes over, and he does a complete 180. He just throws out the limited market freedoms that were in place and forces the entire Soviet economy under his absolute command. And he did this through a series of what he called the 5-year plans. And this is where you can really see the brutal logic of his plan. The goal? Simple: turn a rural, agricultural society into an industrial powerhouse, like overnight. The method? He forcibly took all private farms and lumped them into these huge state-run collective farms. The idea was to use them to feed the new factory workers and fund this whole industrial push. The result, though? Well, the results was an absolute human catastrophe. And the consequences were just horrific. We're talking millions of deaths. Millions. From his political purges, from forced labor in the gulags, and from these devastating famines that were a direct result of his agricultural policies. The human cost, it's just staggering to even think about. Okay, so it's really easy to think this was just a story about the US and the Soviet Union, but it wasn't. Lots of other nations were also turning to powerful centralized governments to handle the crisis. But they often went in a very different direction, one with a super-nationalist, authoritarian bent that would really come to define the next few decades. And this ideology has a name you've definitely heard before: fascism. It was taking root all across Europe,
And it proposed a really simple, but also terrifying, solution to all the economic and social chaos: an all-powerful state. The core idea of fascism is that individual freedom doesn't matter as much as the glory and power of the nation, all of it enforced by one single dictatorial leader. So here's the crucial thing to get. Even though the details were different from place to place, the big trend was the same. The state was stepping in and taking charge. But we have to be careful here, because these weren't all identical projects, right? For example, the populist land reforms and the nationalization of the oil industry down in Mexico had totally different goals than the military-backed fascism that was rising up in Spain.
And in many of these authoritarian states, how did they enforce their economic plans? Well, through some pretty brutal means. They used propaganda as a weapon, they used military force against their own citizens, and they systematically crushed any and all opposition to make sure they held on to power.
Okay, so we've looked at all these different responses: the democratic US, the communist USSR, fascist Italy. So what's the big takeaway here? What's the one thing that connects all of them? It's this. After World War I and the Great Depression, governments everywhere started to take a much more active role in economic life. That is the single most important consequence of this entire period. It didn't matter what the ideology was: democratic, communist, fascist. The crisis permanently blew up the old idea of a hands-off government. That was gone. A whole new era of government intervention had begun. But, and this is a really important but, we have to remember that even though government intervention became the new normal, the how and the what happened next were wildly different. As this quote about the Soviet Union really drives home, some of the most extreme examples of state control didn't lead to a better life. They led to immense, tragic suffering for millions upon millions of people.
And that really leaves us with the big, provocative question of this whole period, doesn't it? When a crisis hits, how much government power is too much? It's that fundamental battle between freedom and security, between the power of the state and the liberty of the individual. And it's a question that, honestly, nations all over the world are still wrestling with today.